Questions and reflections time in this day 6 module. Let's take a look at Hellenism for a moment. This chapter in Sophie's world where the Hellenistic thinkers were talked about. First question is, what central problem did the Cynics, Stoics, and Epicureans generate philosophies for in the attempt to resolve it? Sounds a little circular, doesn't it? But to what branch of philosophy does this line of questioning primarily belong? To understand the branch of philosophy, we're going to need to know the problem. So what was the central problem? Look on page 130, top of the page, just before Gaarder starts going into describing each of the different Hellenistic thinkers, or at least the schools they belonged to. He says, Hellenistic philosophy continued to work with the problems raised by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Common to them all was their desire to discover how mankind should best live and die. They were concerned with ethics. In the new civilization, this became the central philosophical project, and so on and so forth. Now, as I was showing in the in-depth section, there's actually a bit more of a parallel nature to these. The way that it's written here, it almost sounds like these were afterthoughts to Plato and Aristotle. They were all influencing one another to some extent. Remember that Plato and Antisthenes and Aristippus were all alive at the same time. They're all influencing each other to some extent. So it gives this wrong impression that this is coming after. But it does continue after in the schools that are described by Gaarder. So nonetheless, we've got both answers there. The central problem is, how does one live and die? Specifically, those are the main things that the Cynics, the Stoics, and the Epicureans share in common. As spoken in the last video, of course, there was more to them than that, but that is certainly a common ground for them. What branch of philosophy is that? Well, he just said it's ethics. They were concerned with ethics. And so this is one of those of you who are most interested in ethics are going to want to be very fluent in these thinkers and the schools they belong to. What is similar between Plotinus's philosophy of light and darkness and Plato's world of ideas? What is distinctly different? Gaarder brings this up on page 135. And there's a bit of text here, so I wouldn't have expected anyone to quote all of this. But just to get this in passing. So we have that there was meant to be a clear division between soul and body in Plato's doctrine of ideas, and that man was therefore a dual creature consisting partly of earth dust in the sensory world, but also has this immortal soul. And so this continues to run along with Plotinus's work. He says Plotinus believed, though, that the world is a span between two poles. Remember the ball and the light and the dark? At one end is the divine light, which he calls the One. Sometimes he calls it God. At the other end is absolute darkness, which receives none of the light from the One. But Plotinus's point is that this darkness actually has no existence. And what he means here is it has no inherent existence. It is simply the absence of light. In other words, it is not, which Parmenides would probably have some issues with as well. Remember that? All that exists is God or the One, but in the same way that a beam of light grows progressively dimmer and is gradually extinguished, there is somewhere a point that the divine glow cannot reach. According to Plotinus, the soul is illuminated by the light from the One, while matter is the darkness that has no real existence. But the forms in nature have a faint glow of the One. What is that supposed to mean? Well, the forms in nature, again, think of Aristotelian forms now, in the sense that form and material come together to create things, and those forms still, to some extent for Plotinus, echo or resonate or are some derivative of the great form of the good or forms that are closer to. And in that hierarchy, we saw something like daemons or archangels being depicted. So while he maybe isn't thinking of archangels specifically or angels, he is sort of thinking of like these intermediary steps between the form and form's origin, and then the forms, and then the as it were, forms in their more perfect setting, and then forms as they sort of become darker. That is, in this sense, in the analogy, also take on material, as Aristotle has described, and become the beings that you and I know and love today. So the similarity between Plotinus and Plato should be pretty obvious. We went into great measure talking about that. Also, the difference between the two of them. Plotinus is, if nothing else, a monist who does not buy into this immaterial versus material as a difference in kind, but rather as a difference in degree. That is, it's all one thing, and it's only light and the absence of light that would appear to make it look as if there's more than one type of substance or thing. There's one other quick thing worth reading and mentioning again, which we touched on lightly last time. On page 136, midway down, Plotinus's metaphor is rather like Plato's myth of the cave. The closer we get to the mouth of the cave, the closer we get to that which all existence springs from. There's still even that imagery of light, from the darkness of the cave and the light. But in contrast to Plato's clear twofold reality, Plotinus's doctrine is characterized by an experience of wholeness, that oneness. Everything is one, for everything is God. Even the shadows deep down in Plato's cave have a faint glow of the one. We're going to see something similar to this too later on. Sometimes this is called pantheism, where everything in a way partakes in God, that is God. If you were to consider everything in the universe in its entirety as one whole thing, that would be God. There is going to be a similar characterization of reality or the universe later on as well in different thinkers such as Spinoza. Next, what marks a clear distinction in influence and focus between Neoplatonism and earlier Hellenistic philosophy? What religion did the former later come to most influence? Well, let's answer that second part first, just because that's easy. We talked about Christianity a little bit in the last video too. Neoplatonism's influence on Christianity was immense, and that would have been garnered also from Gaarder, the book. At the end of the first paragraph on page 135, Plotinus brought with him to Rome a doctrine of salvation that was to compete seriously with Christianity when its time came. It was still in its early stages. However, Neoplatonism also became a strong influence in mainstream Christian theology as well. So we don't want to equate the two. We don't want to say Neoplatonism is Christianity or Christianity is some form of Neoplatonism. Rather, it would seem to syncretically, again, take on a lot of the Neoplatonist doctrine later on, and thinkers like St. Augustine in particular, who we'll talk again about next time. But now that first part of the question, the clear distinction in influence and focus between Neoplatonism and Hellenistic philosophy, again, sort of going from Hellenism to classical philosophy. On 134 at the bottom, right underneath Neoplatonism, Gaarder writes, as I showed you, Cynicism, Stoicism, and Epicureanism all had their roots in the teachings of Socrates. They also made use of certain of the pre-Socratics, like Heraclitus and Democritus. We didn't go into length on that, by the way. Heraclitus and his idea of the logos was something that we passed over way back. May not even have used the word logos at the time. But the idea is that there is an ultimate thing, there is reason itself. So if what we do is we trust our senses and everything, if everything is experience, or at least everything that we sense and experience is more or less true or valid, how do we relate to one another? How do we not just all have our own individual separate world of experience that is true and devoid of everyone? Well, logos is one way to explain that. Logos is reason itself, or there's lots of different ways we could define logos, but that is going to make it possible for you and I to relate to each other by way of reason. When we have different sensory experiences, we can trust our experiences and then relate those to one another and come to a reasonable stance on what just happened. So that is relied on. And then Democritus, especially in Epicurus, is what I would say, where the idea of atomism, right, and the fact that we can't always trust exactly how the world looks like, but specifically atomism. The idea of atoms was absorbed by Epicureanism, and later Lucretius writes about that again as well, to such an extent, in fact, that Epicurus is accused at later points in history of maybe being godless. That is, going so far as to be atheistic or at least agnostic at best. And Lucretius outright seems to say that this whole the world of the gods and so forth seems to be unnecessary in the face of atomism. So there's that aspect. He continues, though, but the most remarkable philosophic trend in the late Hellenistic period was first and foremost inspired by Plato's philosophy. We therefore call it Neoplatonism. The most important figure was Plotinus, and so on and so forth. It is interesting to note that he came from Alexandria, the city that had been the central meeting point for Greek philosophy and Oriental mysticism for several centuries. So, some clear distinctions. One, Hellenistic philosophy does not touch on anything in the realm of mysticism. This is something new. This is something, it's religiously motivated, it would seem at first, but it's really not in Neoplatonism about religion. It's about this experience of the philosophy, the metaphysics one is actually espousing. That too is really different. As we talked about in the last video, if these others, cynicism, stoicism, if Hellenistic philosophy was mostly concerned with how to live life, eudaimonia, how to live the good life, then it would seem that Neoplatonism is more interested in answering that question only after we've discerned again what is in the world and what isn't. What is the world truly? Metaphysics, in other words, gets priority there again. What differences does Alberto draw out between Western and Eastern forms of mysticism? We did not discuss this at length. There's really, partly it's because I'm very hesitant. There are so many different kinds of religion, mysticism, and so forth. It's really hard. It's like trying to define a shaman. It's like it depends on what culture you're talking about, what a shaman is. So mysticism, like shamanism, to me, is one of those things that's really hard to just kind of package under an umbrella term like that and define. But again, if we concern ourselves with just that main theme of somehow unity with what is true and real, typically hidden to some extent underneath the surface of our everyday experience. So page 137 is where he really talks about the Western-Eastern distinction. Again, fairly oversimplified here, but maybe useful. At the bottom of 137, in Western mysticism, that is with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that is the Abrahamic religions, the mystic emphasizes that his meeting is with a personal God. What does that mean? It means God as a person. That is, reality, if it is God, is in a sense someone you can interact with in some form. Although God is present both in nature and in the human soul, he is also far above and beyond the world. So there's this transcendental element to this version of mysticism. In contrast to that, in Eastern mysticism, that is Hinduism, Buddhism, and Chinese religion, it is more usual to emphasize that the mystic experiences a total fusion with God or the cosmic spirit. So one way we can think about this is in this one characterization, this caricature of Western mysticism. I approach the one God or whatever, and I don't become, but maybe commune with him in some other sense. Like I interact and get to be in his or her good graces and just observe in all that wondrous thing that is before me. While in Eastern mysticism, this caricature that he is drawing here seems to be becoming that thing, realizing, as it were, actually more Buddhist-like, that you are that thing already and have always been that thing, and just simply live on a day-to-day basis. You live thinking that you are something separate from that reality or that oneness. By the way, it's really easy to bypass all this mysticism talk and so forth as if this isn't real philosophy, especially in a super science-oriented culture as we are. I am one of the first promoters of hardcore science as a way of making progress in our modern world. That said, I think we forget how many scientists end up getting to deriving or creating or inventing these new concepts that drive us forward. One of my favorite examples is Einstein, or who I pronounce Einstein because of the German. Einstein was asked before, do you believe in God? And he says something like, I believe in Spinoza's God. We're going to understand what that means later on. But what he seems to have described a lot of the time in his talking through how he derived ideas of special and general relativity is this mystic, almost, experience that he had with just the awe in which he would look at the world and the universe and think about it through that lens. So it's very easy to think that science somehow is this separate system, this organizing principle that gets rid of all these mystical, mythological concepts. And when, in fact, we're talking about reality, no matter which of these we're talking about reality. And the mystic experience of reality needs some due credit for how it goes at the world through experience, as does supposedly science in its empiricism, but a different form of experience, right? And that it arrives at some truth that is hidden under something of these almost illusory type versions of reality. We can describe science using almost the exact same wording. We can say this veil of what I experience, underneath which are the atoms, and then there's the bending of space-time due to relativity and so forth, and then you could get into string theory and all these other things where it's all derivable it all derives from some sort of mathematical principle in a sense. All of these are doing a very similar thing. As this, in this language of mysticism, we should hear just as well a resonance with the language of science when people are talking about it, not just the scientific method and the everyday experimentation and everything, but what actually drives scientific thinkers and physicists, perhaps in particular, to create and embellish the ideas that they do. What biggest surprise do Sophie and Joanna unexpectedly discover in the Major's cabin? How do they each react to this and other items there? All right, so we're going to get out of philosophy for a moment and talk about just Sophie's world specifically, like her world. So 143 is where I would look. We're just going to go over this in passing because this runs all the way through to 147, and there's no need to read all of this, but just to recap what is happening, they discover the postcards in the Major's cabin. And these postcards are dated in such a way that, it's already very odd, the fact that they all come from Lebanon, they're all addressed to Sophie, but then they're dated in such a way that it makes you wonder, how did they get here so fast? And what is he talking about? What is the writer talking about, and so forth? Now, Sophie already has some, and we do too, has some of the clues needed to start to piece together what is happening, but the dating in particular is pretty bizarre. And even before they consider the date of the last postcard, which is written the day of, May 16th, that's today, she said, on page 146, that's Sophie speaking. May 16th, she said, that's today. It can't be, cried Joanna almost angrily. They examined the postmark carefully, but there was no mistaking it, 05/1690. I'm dating this book again a little bit here. The date itself is weird, but there's another thing too. On 145, just before seeing the date, they read his postcard, and it addresses in the PS, the postscript, someday you will meet a girl called Sophie, to Hilda. To give you both a chance to get to know more about each other before you meet, I have begun sending her copies of all the cards I send to you. I expect she will soon begin to catch on, Hilda. As yet, she knows no more than you. She has a girlfriend called Joanna. Maybe she can be of help. Again, you have to sort of put yourself in the place of people who do not have texting service or Twitter, don't have an email to check, well, I mean, email, it's not that email hadn't been invented yet, but it's just not common to be in front of a computer, not on a phone, emailing people. So this is very, very bizarre, even more bizarre than it would be for us to run across this perhaps, because we could imagine all sorts of ways this could be fabricated on the spot. But this is not a time when this would have been conceived of in any way as being easily fabricated. This date that is today and the address of Sophie's best friend, there's clearly, is there stalking going on here? What is happening? They each react to it a little bit differently, and that's important to point out here too. Sophie already has some of those details, so you could say, well, she reacts knowing a little bit about it already. But let's delve into their characters a little bit further than that. Joanna, on page 146, says, Joanna was by far the more scared of the two. The business with Hilda and her father was nothing new to Sophie. And Sophie says, I think it has something to do with the brass mirror. Joanna jumped again. You don't actually think the cards come fluttering out of the mirror the minute they are stamped in Lebanon. Do you have a better explanation? Says Sophie. So Sophie is kind of prying. She's curious this way. She's seen some strange stuff already, but this also seems to be a character trait of hers. She's groping around for possible explanations already. That curiosity and that open-mindedness to what could happen seems to at least start to lead her in directions. Maybe not the correct direction yet, but it's going to lead her eventually to the answer. Joanna is just scared, and she seems to, each moment when Sophie, for instance, wants to take the mirror with them, Joanna shuts it down. She wants to shut this all down. She wants to get away from it. Let's leave, Sophie. Let's leave. This keeps being emphasized. Joanna is that friend of ours or person we know who, when the crazy stuff starts to come up about the world, maybe we brought it up or it just comes up on its own accord, is the person who wants to shut down and get back to life as normal. Wants to turn on the television screen or check out a YouTube video these days, as it were. Do something to bring things back to normal. Go register for a Netflix account and just kind of zone out at the end of the day rather than confront this question of what is happening in the world right now. What bizarre thing is this that's changing our culture? Or maybe more broadly, how does life and death work? What does comprise our world? These questions are not Joanna's types of questions. They are clearly becoming Sophie's. So their reactions are telling in this, right? Joanna's scared. She wants to run. She wants to get out of there. She doesn't want anything to do with this stuff. Sophie pries and she wants to take the mirror. She wants to get at the heart of this. And these are, therefore, they're foils to one another's characters in that way. Why do you suppose Hilda's father is choosing at this time to impose a severe censorship on himself? That comes up very just before what we just read on page 144, the I think third, the postcard that's like two before the last one. Dear Hilda, down here we take one day at a time. If there is one thing I'm going to remember from these months in Lebanon, it's all that's waiting. But I'm doing what I can so you can have as great a 15th birthday as possible. I can't say any more at the moment. I'm imposing a severe censorship on myself. Love, Dad. The text here is important again. Why the severe censorship? Of course, I can't answer this for you without giving things away. But take clues from the text. I'm going to remember from these months in Lebanon, it's all this waiting. What's all this waiting? What's all the waiting in Lebanon because he's waiting for his service to be carried out? Or is he talking about another form of waiting? I'm doing what I can so you can have as great a 15th birthday as possible. Okay, so he's waiting for something? Is he waiting for something regarding her birthday? Maybe he's going to show up for a surprise party. That could be it. But then why give any hint whatsoever about this? Why is he putting this here in this postcard to Hilda? Why would he say anything to Hilda? And again, what does this have to do with Sophie, as it seems to have something to do with Sophie as they move on through the postcards? So come up with a theory. Come up with a hypothesis, for what you think could be going on here. What is he censoring himself of? He's already indicated several things. One, that he has some relationship to Sophie that she is not aware of. Two, that the philosopher also seems to have some relationship with him. We can get into that another time, but you can see that they do, that the philosopher talks about him, or at least is aware of him. And then here he is, he's writing to his daughter Hilda about waiting for something, about all this waiting for something. What is he waiting for? Why is he giving any inkling to her about it? Why all these postcards? Okay, last question. What can you imagine being a possible explanation for the impossibility regarding the dating of the postcards? This, again, I don't want to give anything away, but I want you to think carefully about the dates. Not specifically, not so much like what happens during this day normally in the year, but just what could be going on. April 28th, May 4th, May 6th, May 9th. This impatient father is writing multiple postcards to Hilda. And then he makes this statement on, again, page 145. I am now so bursting with all these secrets for your birthday that I have to stop myself several times a day from calling home and blowing the whole thing. It is something that simply grows and grows. And as you know, when a thing gets bigger and bigger, it's more difficult to keep it to yourself. Followed immediately by, I have begun sending her, Sophie, copies of all the cards I send to you. Okay, why copies of the card? What's the deal again? I expect she will soon begin to catch on. Why send copies of these cards to Sophie? We can ask ourselves questions about this. Copies of the postcards wouldn't mean like a Xerox copy at this day and age. He would have had to handwrite those. Do the postcards all have the same date, or do they have different dates? And how is he getting the cards to Sophie? Maybe through the philosopher, but why didn't the philosopher take these cards out of the Major's cabin when he moved? Why are they still there? So if he's sending them to Sophie, it's not clear how he's sending them, if they're sitting there in the Major's cabin, unless he thinks that's where she lives or something like that. And again, are the dates going to match on both Hilda's and Sophie's cards? Is he on the same day? Are they being postmarked on the same day because he's writing them the same day? These are all things you should take into consideration while trying to think about this explanation. Okay, so next week's exciting. We're going to be talking about the two cultures. We're also going to talk about the medieval times, or Middle Ages as they're commonly called. Lots of great stuff in there too.